The ballroom was glowing with golden lights, crystal chandeliers hanging high above, and polished marble floors shining under the weight of expensive shoes. Men in black suits and women in sparkling dresses filled the place with laughter. There, voices mixed with the sound of soft jazz played by the band near the corner. Glasses of champagne clinked, waiters carried silver trays with careful balance, and the air smelled of perfume and roasted food. Among them moved Emily, a young waitress, with tired hands but bright eyes. Her uniform was neat but plain. She kept her hair tied back and walked quickly from table to table. She never slowed down, for she knew one wrong step could bring embarrassment in front of the elite crowd. The guests hardly noticed her. To them, she was just part of the service, invisible among their wealth and pride. But Emily noticed everything. She saw how their jewelry glittered, how their conversations danced around money, influence, and travel. She listened to their laughter but never joined it. For her, this grand hall was not just a workplace. It was a world she did not belong to. And yet, every time her eyes slid toward the corner of the hall, her heart stirred. There, standing quietly like a giant, was the grand piano. Its black surface gleamed under the lights, its ivory keys shining like small stars. Emily's steps slowed whenever she passed it. She could almost hear it calling to her, reminding her of the dream she once carried. Years ago, before life became heavy with bills and responsibilities, Emily had spent her evenings at an old second-hand keyboard in her tiny apartment. The keys were chipped, and some refused to play, but she had poured her soul into them. Music had been her escape, her secret language, her one way of speaking to the world when words failed her. But now, she worked long shifts, carrying trays instead of playing notes. Her dream of becoming a pianist had been buried under the weight of survival. Still, as she moved through the grand hall, she couldn't help stealing glances at the piano. Her heart whispered what her lips dared not say. If only just once she could touch those keys. If only she could show what music lived inside her, but reality was cruel. The people around her belonged to another world. To them, she was just a server, not someone worthy of stepping on stage. She knew if she even touched that piano without permission, she might be thrown out, mocked, or worse, lose her job. And yet, her eyes betrayed her heart again and again. Finding the piano no matter where she was in the room, the crowd clapped as the band played their final notes for the set. The leader bowed, promising to return after a short break. The hall filled with chatter, louder now without the music. Emily carried a tray of drinks, weaving between the tables. She passed one guest who noticed her gaze flicker toward the piano. He smirked and leaned to his friend, whispering something. Soon both laughed softly. Their laughter was sharp, not joyful, and it made her cheeks burn. Still, Emily forced a smile. She placed the glasses on the table with steady hands. Her training told her not to react, not to let them see her hurt. But inside, her chest ached. She knew what they had seen, her longing glance at the piano. To them, it was funny. A servant, girl dreaming too big. Emily moved on. Her steps quick, her face calm, but her thoughts heavy. She told herself she must forget. She must bury the foolish desire. But the sound of the piano echoed in her memory. She remembered how her fingers once flew over the keys, how the notes wrapped around her like a warm blanket, how music had made her feel alive. She paused for a moment near the edge of the hall, her tray now empty. Her eyes lifted again, and there it was, the piano, waiting silently. The guests were too busy laughing and talking to notice her small hesitation. The chandeliers sparkled above. The marble reflected the light, and in the middle of it all, the piano seemed to shine brightest. Emily let out a quiet breath and reminded herself of her place. She was here to serve, not to dream. The night was long, and there were many more tables to attend, but deep inside, her heart whispered a dangerous promise. This piano was not just an instrument, it was a door to the life she had once believed in. And though she could not step through it tonight, she felt it, a stirring, a reminder that her story was not yet over. And as the voices of the elite rose around her, Emily walked forward with her tray, her eyes lowered, but her heart awake. not knowing that this night, in this very hall, her hidden dream would soon be tested, and the piano she longed for would no longer be silent. Emily returned to the staff corner, her tray now resting on a metal table. The other waiters chatted quickly about tips, about the rude guests, about finishing. The night without mistakes, Emily only nodded when spoken to. Her mind was somewhere else, drifting back to the piano. She leaned against the wall for a moment, taking a breath. Her eyes closed, and in that short pause she remembered her childhood. She saw herself sitting on the floor of her small bedroom, her father carrying an old keyboard under his arm. It had missing keys and cracked edges, but to her it was treasure. She had touched it carefully that night as if it were something holy. From that day on, every free hour was given to music. Emily had taught herself to play, copying songs she heard. On the radio, sometimes creating her own. Her fingers were not trained by a teacher, but by passion. She learned through mistakes, through endless nights of practice while her family slept. Even when her father passed away, the keyboard was the one thing that kept her heart alive. But life had turned. Her mother fell sick. Bills stacked on the table. Emily had no choice but to quit school and take small jobs. First it was washing dishes, then cleaning houses, and now serving in this grand hall where she was invisible. The music that once filled her nights was replaced by exhaustion when she came home. Her hands were too sore to play, and sometimes she didn't even switch on the old keyboard, dust covering it slowly. Still, the love of music never left. It was inside her like a second heartbeat. Whenever she walked past a music shop, her feet slowed. Whenever she heard a piano in the distance, her chest ached. And tonight in this hall of wealth, the sight of the shining grand piano made that ache too strong to ignore. Emily picked up another tray, this one heavy with crystal glasses. She forced her face into a smile and moved through the crowd. Her ears caught fragments of their conversations. Stocks, art collections, new cars, private trips to islands. Not one word about struggle, not one word about sacrifice. She felt like a ghost in their world, carrying drinks while carrying unspoken dreams. At one table, a young woman in a glittering red dress laughed loudly. She waved her hand for more wine. Emily approached carefully, setting the glass before her. But just as she did, her eyes once again betrayed her, sliding across the hall toward the piano. Her longing was clear. The woman noticed and smirked. She leaned close to her companion and whispered. The man turned to look at Emily with raised brows. They both laughed under their breath. Emily's face warmed. Her heart dropped. She quickly turned and walked away. She told herself not to care, not to dream. Yet the pull of the piano was too strong. She reached the edge of the room where a window reflected her tired face. She hardly recognized herself anymore. The girl who once believed in music looked older, worn down. But deep in her eyes, the spark was still there. That spark frightened her and comforted her at the same time. The band began packing their instruments. For a short rest, the hall grew noisier with chatter. A man near the center table noticed Emily staring again. His smile was cruel. He called out loudly enough for those around him to hear. "Do you want to play, little waitress? Maybe entertain us with your skills." The nearby guests laughed. Some looked at Emily with mocking interest. Others ignored her completely. Her hands shook. She wanted to disappear. She bowed her head, mumbled an apology, and hurried away. But inside something burned. It was not only shame but also desire. She wanted to sit at that piano more than anything. Behind the staff curtain, she placed the tray down with trembling hands. A fellow waiter, older and kinder, noticed her pale face. "Are you all right?" he asked softly. She forced a smile and nodded. "Yes, just tired," she whispered, but her heart was racing, her throat tight. She sat for a moment on a wooden chair, listening to the noise of the crowd through the thin wall. The piano was still silent, waiting. She imagined herself walking up to it, imagined her fingers touching the keys, imagined the first soft note filling the hall. She felt goosebumps on her arms. It was almost real in her mind, but then reality returned like cold water. She could lose her job, she could embarrass herself. What if she played and failed? What if they laughed harder? The fear fought against the fire in her chest. She held her hands together tightly. the same hands that once made music, and she whispered to herself, "Not tonight, not here." Yet she knew the truth. She would never stop looking at that piano. She would never stop longing. It was not just an instrument to her, it was a voice she had been forced to silence, and silence was killing her slowly. The night moved on, guests still laughing, glasses clinking, chandeliers shining. But for Emily, time felt slower, heavier. Every step she took, every tray she carried, was filled with a war inside her. Her body worked, but her soul kept dreaming. She thought of her father, of the nights she promised him she would play on a stage one day. She thought of her younger self, full of hope. And as she glanced once more at the grand piano, its black surface glowing under the lights, she knew deep inside that fate was circling her. She could not escape forever. Something was coming, something that would test whether her dream was truly gone, or whether music was still waiting for her to claim it. Emily kept moving between the tables, her tray balanced carefully in her hands. The guests hardly looked at her except when they needed something. To them, she was just another servant, but she could feel the weight of their glances, especially after the cruel remark from the man who had mocked her about the piano. She tried to keep her head down, yet inside her chest her heart beat faster every time her eyes drifted toward the instrument. The grand piano stood silently in the corner, polished and proud. Its lid reflected the golden chandeliers above. To Emily, it looked like a treasure locked away. She could almost imagine her fingers brushing the keys, the sound echoing through the vast hall. She longed for it so much that her throat tightened, but each longing glance carried a risk. Someone was bound to notice again, and someone did. At one of the nearest tables, a group of wealthy young guests sat drinking, laughing. Their voices were loud, their gestures careless. One woman in a glittering, silver dress saw Emily's eyes drift toward the piano again. A sly smile curved her lips. She leaned closer to the others and whispered something. Soon the group was chuckling. Emily placed a glass on their table, trying to leave quickly, but the woman's sharp voice cut through the air. "Do you want to play it, little waitress?" she asked, pretending to sound sweet. Her friends laughed. One man tapped his glass with a spoon and added, "Yes, maybe she can entertain us. Give us some background music." Their laughter spread, not just among their table, but to others, who overheard. A few guests turned their heads watching Emily, some with amusement, some with boredom, as if the moment was nothing more than a side joke. Emily froze for a second, the tray trembling slightly in her hands. Her face burned hot. She felt the stares pressing against her skin. She wanted to disappear. Her lips parted, but no words came. She lowered her eyes, muttered a soft apology, and quickly walked away. Her shoes clicked against the marble floor as she moved. But her steps felt heavy. Inside, shame coiled around her heart, but beneath the shame another feeling stirred. Anger. Not at the guests, not even at the cruel jokes, but at herself, at the way she had allowed them to see her secret. She had given them power over her dream by letting her eyes wander too long toward the piano. Still, she could not hate the dream. She could never hate music. It was the only thing that had ever truly belonged to her. It was her father's gift, her childhood comfort, her hidden strength. No mockery could take that away. She went to the staff's corner again, setting down her tray with shaking hands. Her chest rose and fell quickly. She tried to steady herself, tried to breathe, but her thoughts would not stop. She remembered the sound of the guests' laughter, the cruel smiles, and the sting of humiliation. Another waiter, older and kind-hearted, noticed her expression. He asked gently, "Are you all right?" Emily forced a smile and nodded. "Yes, I'm fine," she whispered. But the truth was written in her eyes. She was not fine. She felt small, invisible, crushed between her reality and her dream. The chatter of the crowd grew louder as the band prepared to return. The musicians tuned their instruments, waiting to begin another set. Emily peeked through the curtain at the hall. She saw the piano again, untouched, waiting. A part of her imagined walking up to it, ignoring the stares, ignoring the rules, just sitting down and letting her fingers speak for her. But then the image of the laughing guests returned, mocking her, doubting her. She shook her head quickly, pushing the thought away. She could not risk it. She needed her job. She needed money for rent, for food, for survival. Dreams could not pay the bills. She reminded herself of this again and again. But it felt like stabbing her own heart each time. Later, as she carried another tray across the room, she overheard the cruel woman in silver again. The woman was still whispering, still smirking. She looked like she actually thought she could play. Imagine that. A waitress at a piano, it would be a circus. The others chuckled, raising their glasses. Emily's steps slowed for just a moment. Her throat tightened. She did not turn, did not react. She kept moving, but her eyes burned. Her dream felt like a fragile bird trapped inside her chest, beating its wings harder and harder, begging to be free. She placed the tray down and walked toward the far edge of the hall where fewer people stood. She paused by the tall windows, her reflection faint against the glass. She stared at herself, the plain uniform, the tired face, and wondered if the world was right. Maybe she did not belong at the piano, maybe she never would. But then she remembered the nights with her father, the way his hand rested on her shoulder as she played, the pride in his eyes even when the music was clumsy. She remembered how he told her, "Don't ever let anyone tell you where you don't belong. Your music will prove it." The memory cut through her despair like light breaking through clouds. Her hands trembled as she held the tray tighter. She whispered softly to herself, so no one could hear, "I still belong, I still can play." She lifted her chin slightly, though her steps remained careful and quiet. The night carried on, laughter echoing across the hall, chandeliers sparkling brighter, glasses clinking like bells. But Emily's heart was no longer steady. It was filled with tension, with fire and fear. She had been mocked, yes, but inside she knew something else was rising. The piano had waited long enough, and so had she. The crowd might laugh again, the elite might scoff, but deep inside she felt that her moment was drawing closer. The question was not if she would touch the keys, but when. The night moved forward with the same rhythm of laughter, clinking glasses and murmured conversations. The chandeliers glowed above, and the air carried the sweet scent of wine and roasted food. Emily walked between the tables, her tray balanced perfectly, her face calm, her steps steady. But inside her heart was restless. The memory of the cruel laughter from the guests clung to her like a shadow. She kept her eyes low, but still, every few moments her gaze betrayed her, drifting toward the piano in the corner. The grand piano sat silent, waiting. The band had finished their first round and stepped away. They were gathering at the side of the hall for a short rest, tuning their instruments and speaking softly to one another. Without the music, the chatter of the guests grew louder. The room was filled with voices rising and falling, some sharp with gossip, some lazy with drink. Emily's ears caught none of it. She could only hear the silent call of the piano. Then it happened. One of the men from earlier, the one who had laughed at her when she glanced at the piano, raised his glass and spoke loudly. "The music has stopped. Who will play for us now?" His tone was playful, but his eyes were fixed on Emily. His words caught the attention of the nearby tables. People chuckled, curious. Some followed his gaze toward the young waitress standing with her tray. Emily froze. She felt heat rushing to her cheeks. Her fingers tightened around the tray until her knuckles turned white. She prayed the moment would pass, that they would turn their attention back to their drinks. But the man was not finished. He smirked and said, "Perhaps our little waitress can give us a tune. She seems very interested in the piano." Laughter spread through the hall, sharp and cruel. Emily's chest tightened, her stomach churned. She wanted to sink into the marble floor. She tried to shake her head, whispering, "No, I can't." But her voice was too soft to reach them. Then another guest, an older man with silver hair, raised his eyebrows and leaned back in his chair. "Why not let her try? It could be amusing." His voice carried weight, and soon, whispers began to ripple through the tables. Guests turned their eyes to her, Some curious, some mocking, some simply bored and looking for a distraction. Emily's legs felt heavy as stone. She wanted to run, to hide behind the staff curtain, but her feet betrayed her, keeping her in place. Her heart pounded against her ribs like a drum. She shook her head again, whispering, "No." But the crowd was already buzzing. Already. A few people clapped their hands on the table, calling her toward the piano. The band members exchanged uneasy looks, unsure if they should step in, but none of them moved. For the guests of this hall, money and power spoke louder than kindness, and tonight the crowd had decided their amusement would come from seeing a young waitress at the piano. Emily stood, trembling, her breath shallow. Then, to her surprise, she heard a voice inside her, a quiet but steady whisper. It said, "Go." It said, "Show them." She didn't know if it was her father's memory speaking to her or her own hidden courage, but her body began to move. Her steps were slow, almost dreamlike, as she walked away from the tables. Every eye followed her. The laughter softened into murmurs, then into silence, as the crowd watched the plain waitress in her simple uniform move toward the shining grand piano. The hall that had once ignored her now gave her full attention. Each step felt heavier than the last. Her hands trembled, but she kept them at her sides. She could hear her own heartbeat in her ears, louder than the chatter, louder than the clinking glasses. She passed the edge of the marble dance floor, and finally, she stood before the piano. Up close, it was even more magnificent than she imagined. Its polished black surface reflected her face. Her hand reached out slowly, hesitating just above the keys. The room was completely still now, all waiting for her to embarrass herself, all waiting for proof that a servant girl had no place touching such an instrument. She sat down carefully. On the bench, her knees almost buckled as she lowered herself. Her fingers hovered above the ivory keys. Her chest rose and fell quickly. She felt the weight of every gaze pressing against her back. Her mind screamed at her to stop, to stand up, to run away before she ruined herself. But another memory surfaced. Her father's voice, calm and strong. "Don't let anyone tell you where you don't belong. Your music will prove it." Emily closed her eyes for a brief moment. She inhaled deeply, letting the noise of the hall fade away. In her mind, she was not surrounded by mocking guests. She was back in her tiny room with the old broken keyboard, back where music was hers alone. She placed her trembling hands on the piano keys. The silence of the hall thickened, every ear strained, waiting, some for laughter, some for a miracle. Emily pressed the first key. A soft, clear note filled the air, and the world seemed to shift. She pressed another, then another. A melody began to form, fragile but beautiful, like the first drops of rain after a long drought. The hall that had moments ago buzzed with laughter was now frozen, caught in the spell of the very thing they had mocked. Emily's fear was still there, but her fingers moved as if they remembered something her mind had forgotten. The piano responded to her touch, its voice merging with her soul. She forgot the mocking eyes, forgot the chandeliers, forgot the cruel guests. She was no longer a waitress. She was a pianist. And for the first time in years, she was exactly where she belonged. The first few notes trembled as they left the piano, soft and delicate, like a whisper in the middle of the grand hall. For a moment, Emily thought she might stop. She thought her fingers would freeze and the crowd would laugh at her for daring to try. But then something inside her heart steadied. The music she had buried for so long rose again, and her hands began to move with a rhythm she thought she had lost forever. The hall grew strangely quiet. The laughter and whispers died down. Even the clinking of glasses stopped as the elite guests leaned back in their chairs. At first, some smirked, waiting for her to stumble and prove them right. But instead, a soft melody poured out. It was smooth and gentle, like a story told through sound. Emily's fingers moved carefully at first, each note carrying her nerves. But as the music flowed, her fear began to fade. She thought of her father, of the nights she had practiced in her small room. She thought of how he told her that music was not about perfection. It was about feeling. She let that memory guide her, and the melody deepened, stronger, clearer. The piano filled the room with warmth. Its voice was powerful but tender. It rose above the silence, wrapping around the guests. Some who had been ready to laugh found themselves leaning forward, their smiles fading into wonder. They had not expected this. They had expected clumsy noise, not music that reached into their hearts. Emily's eyes remained closed. She didn't dare look at them. Instead, she let herself sink into the song. Each note carried pieces of her life, the struggles, the lost dreams, the nights of hunger, the mornings of exhaustion. She poured it all into the keys. The sound was not just music anymore, it was her soul speaking. A woman near the front table gasped softly. Her jeweled hand touched her chest as if the melody had caught her by surprise. Another man lowered his glass slowly, his eyes fixed on Emily as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. The cruel smirks vanished one by one, replaced with quiet awe. Still, not everyone was convinced. In the far corner, a group whispered among themselves. "It's luck," one muttered. "She will make a mistake any second." They waited for her to falter, but she didn't. Her fingers grew steadier, her hands, moving with growing confidence. The melody built like a gentle river turning into a flowing stream. Emily shifted smoothly into a stronger section of the song. The notes climbed higher, her hands crossing over each other. Her body swayed slightly with the rhythm. She forgot the eyes watching her. She forgot she was a waitress in a plain uniform. In that moment, she was nothing less than a pianist commanding a hall filled with light. The chandeliers above seemed to shimmer brighter as the music lifted. The guests who once mocked her now sat completely still, caught by the power of her playing. Even the staff hiding near the curtain peeked out, their mouths slightly open. Some of them had worked with Emily for years, yet none had ever seen this side of her. The music told its story without words. It spoke of pain and longing, of hope and beauty. It rose and fell, pulling hearts with it. Some guests closed their eyes just to feel it more deeply. Others leaned closer to see her fingers move so quickly across the ivory keys. When Emily finally let the song soften, her hands slowing to a gentle end, the hall was breathless. For one long moment, no one moved. The last note hung in the air like a fragile drop of crystal. Then silence. Emily opened her eyes. Her chest was heaving, her hands trembling on the keys. She was afraid again, afraid that maybe it had not been enough, that maybe they would laugh now. But the hall remained silent, heavy with something she could not name. Then, softly at first, came the sound of clapping. One pair of hands, then another. Then the applause grew louder and louder until it crashed like thunder through the hall. The same people who had mocked her now rose to their feet, clapping and cheering. Some shouted, "Bravo!" Others whistled. Some even wiped tears from their eyes. Emily sat frozen. Her mind could not believe it. She had expected shame, yet here was applause so strong it shook her. Her lips parted in shock, her heart beat wildly. She had dreamed of this moment all her life, and now it was real. In the middle of the applause, she saw the cruel woman in silver. The woman who had mocked her earlier now sat still, her face pale, her smirk gone. She looked embarrassed, unable to meet anyone's eyes. The man who had first called out to her looked down at his drink, shame written across his face. But Emily did not focus on them anymore. She looked at the faces of the people clapping, and for the first time in years she felt seen, truly seen, not as a waitress, not as a servant, but as someone who had something to give. Her music had reached them, and nothing could take that away. Her eyes glistened with tears. She lowered her head, whispering quietly to herself, "Papa, I did it." And as the applause echoed around her, she realized that her dream, though buried, had never died. It had only been waiting for the moment she was brave enough to let it live again. The sound of applause still shook the walls of the grand hall. Emily sat frozen on the piano bench, her hands trembling above the keys. She had never expected this, never imagined the elite crowd would rise to their feet for her. The same people who had mocked her now clapped with shining eyes. The chandeliers glittered above as if celebrating with her, but in her heart, Emily was struggling to believe it was real. Her mind kept asking, was this really happening? Or would she wake up and find herself back in her small room, staring at her broken keyboard. She blinked, but the crowd was still there, their faces full of awe. Then, slowly, she lifted her head, and her eyes swept across the hall. She saw things she thought she would never see. A woman in red dabbed her eyes with a silk handkerchief. A man with silver hair smiled warmly at her, and even the waitstaff behind the curtain stood with open mouths, clapping softly. Some of the same guests who had mocked her earlier now shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, too ashamed to meet her gaze. The applause did not fade quickly. It grew, spreading from one table to the next. Soon the sound was like rolling thunder. It echoed across the marble floors, bouncing off the high ceilings. Emily's chest ached with the weight of it. She pressed a hand against her heart, feeling it race wildly. The music she had played was not just a performance. It was her life, her struggles, her hidden dream poured into sound. And now, to see, it touched so many people, filled her with something she had almost forgotten. Hope. She stood slowly from the piano bench. Her knees were weak, but she straightened her back. For the first time all evening, she did not feel small. She did not feel invisible. She felt like she belonged. She bowed her head slightly, shy yet thankful, and the applause grew louder still. But in the corner of her eye, she caught sight of the cruel woman in silver. The woman's face was tight, her lips pressed into a thin line. She looked furious that a waitress had stolen the night. Next to her, the man who had first called Emily out stared down at his drink, shame covering his face. Their cruelty had been drowned by her music, and now they had no power. The crowd began whispering excitedly. Some guests turned to each other, speaking with surprise. "She plays like a professional," one said. "Where did she learn?" asked another. A man at the front table shook his head. "I have heard pianists from across the world, but that was from the soul." Emily heard fragments of their words, and her chest tightened. She wanted to cry, but she held her tears back. She wanted to shout, but her voice was trapped. So she stood quietly, breathing in the moment, letting it wash over her. The band members who had stepped aside earlier now exchanged glances. Even they looked impressed. One of them, the band leader, gave her a small nod of respect. It was not mockery, not surprise. It was recognition, the kind that musicians give to one another. Emily's throat tightened at the sight. Suddenly, one of the wealthiest guests, an older man with sharp eyes and a tall presence, rose from his seat. His cane tapped against the floor as he stepped forward. He was known in the city, respected by everyone. His voice carried across the hall as he said, "That was no ordinary performance, young lady." The crowd hushed instantly, listening. The man's eyes softened as he looked at Emily. "That was a gift." Gasps spread through the tables. The man was not one to give praise lightly. His words carried weight. Emily lowered her head, whispering, "Thank you." Though her voice was barely heard, more applause followed. But this time it was mixed with something deeper: admiration, respect. Even those who had doubted her earlier now clapped with genuine feeling. The hall, once filled with laughter at her expense, now honored her. Emily's heart swelled, but fear, still, whispered in her mind. She thought of her job. Would she be punished for stepping out of line? Would the manager scold her for daring to touch the piano? Her smile faltered for a moment, but then she looked again at the crowd. Their faces glowed with wonder, and she knew one truth. This moment could not be taken from her, no matter what came after. The applause finally began to soften. Guests returned to their seats, but their eyes lingered on Emily. Some still whispered to each other. Some even waved for her to come closer. But she stepped back from the piano, her hands folded, her heart still racing. She walked quietly toward the edge of the hall, her steps light but unsure. The staff curtain was close. Safety was close. Yet her ears caught the whispers following. "She must play again," someone said. "She cannot hide," said another. And in that instant, Emily realized that something had shifted, not just in the hall, but in her life. She was no longer invisible, no longer just a waitress carrying trays. She had been seen, truly seen. And though fear still tugged at her, another voice inside her whispered louder now. It said, "You have woken something you can never put back to sleep." As she slipped behind the staff curtain, her fellow waiters rushed to her side, their faces lit with surprise and pride. "Emily, that was," one began. "Incredible." Another finished. The older waiter, who had spoken kindly to her earlier, smiled and whispered, "I told you. You had more inside you than they knew." Emily's eyes filled with tears. She covered her mouth with her hand, unable to hold back her trembling. Her dream had stepped out of the shadows tonight, and the world had applauded. She didn't know what would come next, whether she would be punished or praised. But one thing was certain. The piano had given her voice back, and no mockery, no cruel remark, no fear could silence her again. The storm inside her had finally turned into music, and it was only the beginning. The hall was still buzzing with excitement long after Emily stepped away from the piano. Guests leaned toward one another, speaking in hurried whispers. Some clapped again even after the applause had ended, as if they could not get enough of the sound they had just heard. The chandeliers above glittered, but their light seemed softer now. As though the room itself had changed, Emily stood near the curtain, her chest still rising and falling quickly. She held her hands together, her fingers trembling. It felt unreal. The memory of her music still floated in the air, and her heart struggled to believe that it was truly her who had filled the grand hall with sound. Then, through the noise of the crowd, she noticed a sudden quiet forming. A path was opening through the tables. The wealthy older man with silver hair, the one who had praised her music, was walking toward her. His presence alone commanded silence. Guests leaned back to give him space. His cane tapped lightly against the marble floor as he moved, and every step echoed with authority. Emily's breath caught. She had seen this man before from afar. She knew his reputation. He was not only one of the richest men in the city, but also a patron of the arts. His support had launched the careers of musicians, singers, and dancers across the country. And now his eyes were on her. He stopped just a few steps from the piano, turning toward Emily with a calm but steady gaze. His voice rang out, firm yet kind. "Young lady, what is your name?" The room held its breath. Emily froze. Her lips parted, but no words came. Finally, she whispered, "Emily." The name seemed small in the great hall, but it carried to every corner. The man nodded. "Emily," he repeated slowly, "you played as though you had lived 100 lives. That was not entertainment. That was truth." His words struck like lightning, and the crowd murmured with awe. Emily lowered her eyes, her cheeks burning. She wanted to shrink, yet at the same time her heart lifted with a strange, unfamiliar pride. The man smiled faintly and said, "Tell me, where did you learn?" Her throat tightened. She thought of her father, of the broken keyboard, of the countless nights practicing alone. She could not tell the whole story in that moment, so she simply answered softly, "At home. I practiced by myself." The guests exchanged shocked whispers. "Self-taught?" Someone said. "Impossible," another muttered, but the man only smiled more. "That explains it," he said. "Your music came from the heart, not from lessons. That is why it moved us." He turned to the crowd, raising his voice. "Ladies and gentlemen, tonight we have witnessed something rare, a soul hidden in plain sight, a talent that was almost lost to silence. And now, we must not let it fade." The guests erupted in applause again. But this time it was different, not just appreciation. It was agreement. Some called her name. Others demanded she play again. A woman in a diamond necklace even rose to her feet, shouting, "Encore!" Emily's chest ached with emotion. Her hands trembled. She had gone from being mocked to being begged for more. Her dream, the one she had buried, was now alive before everyone, but not every face in the room glowed with joy. At the far table, the cruel woman in silver sat stiffly, her lips tight, her eyes sharp with jealousy. The man who had first mocked Emily still stared down at his glass, his shame too heavy to lift his gaze. Their laughter had vanished, replaced with silence that tasted bitter. Emily saw them but did not let their shadows darken her moment. Instead, she stepped forward slowly. Her voice was quiet but steady. "If you wish, I can play again. The hall answered with thunderous clapping and cheers. She returned to the piano, her legs no longer trembling. Her heart still raced, but now it was with fire, not fear. She sat on the bench, placed her hands on the keys, and began another melody. This time she did not start carefully. She played with strength, her fingers flying across the keys. The notes leapt into the air like sparks. The crowd gasped, then fell silent, caught once again in the storm of her music. Her second song was not soft like the first. It was bold, powerful, filled with energy. It told of battles fought, of dreams that refused to die. Her body swayed with the rhythm, her hair slipping loose from its tie. She was no longer a quiet waitress. She was alive, commanding the room with every note. The guests could not look away. Some leaned forward, gripping the edges of their tables. Others closed their eyes to feel the power of the music in their hearts. The chandeliers seemed to tremble with the force of it. When she struck the final chord, the sound rang out like thunder. The silence afterward was deep. Then once more the hall exploded in applause, louder than ever before. People rose to their feet again, shouting, cheering. Some even called her name. Emily sat still, her chest rising and falling, her eyes wide with disbelief. Tears slipped down her cheeks. But this time they were not from shame. They were from joy. The crowd's admiration washed over her like a wave, and she knew something inside her had changed forever. The older man with the cane stepped closer. He leaned on it slightly and smiled at her with kind eyes. "Emily," he said, "I would like to speak with you after tonight. Your talent should not remain hidden. You belong on a stage, not behind a tray." Her breath caught. Her knees nearly gave way. She could barely whisper, "Thank you." The crowd clapped again, this time not just for her music, but for the promise of what was to come. The cruel laughter that once tried to bury her dream was gone, replaced by cheers that lifted her higher than she had ever dared imagine. And as she sat on the piano bench, her tears shining under the golden lights, Emily realized the truth. This night had changed her life. She had not just played music, she had claimed her place in the world, and no one could take it away again. The applause still echoed in Emily's ears long after the last note faded. She sat on the piano bench, her hands resting on her lap, her body trembling but her spirit soaring higher than ever before. She had never imagined this moment, never dreamed that people who once mocked her would now rise to their feet, cheering her name. The grand hall that had seemed like a cage at the beginning of the night now felt like a stage built for her alone. As the clapping slowed, the older man with the cane stepped closer once again. His sharp eyes softened with warmth. "Emily," he said, his voice carrying across the room. "Tonight you reminded us that greatness can come from anywhere. You must not stop here. Your music belongs to the world." His words struck her heart with a force she could not describe. She had lived her life being invisible. Yet now the most powerful voice in the room was lifting her up. The crowd agreed with him. Some shouted for her to play again. Others called her name like she was already a star. Emily could hardly breathe. She felt as if she were caught between two worlds, the world of the waitress who carried trays, and the world of the pianist who carried hearts with her music. Her fellow waiters peeked out from the curtain, their eyes wide with pride and disbelief. One of them whispered, "She's one of us." And for the first time, Emily realized she had inspired not only the rich but also the people who worked silently in the shadows like her. But among the shining faces, Emily also noticed the ones filled with shame. The cruel woman in silver sat frozen, her eyes sharp, but her cheeks pale. She had mocked Emily, laughed at her, and now she had nothing left to say. The man who had first called Emily out sat slouched in his chair, his glass untouched, his pride broken. Their cruelty had been defeated not by anger, not by revenge, but by music. Emily rose slowly from the piano bench, her knees still weak, but her back straight. She bowed her head slightly and the crowd clapped again, softer this time. "Respectful," she whispered to herself. "Papa, I did it." And for a moment she felt as if her father was there, standing in the hall with her, smiling with the same pride he once had when she was a little girl practicing. On the broken keyboard, The wealthy man stepped closer and spoke in a voice only she could hear. "Meet me after the event, Emily. You should not waste your gift here. I will help you if you are willing." Her heart stopped. She wanted to cry, but she managed to nod. "Yes, I am willing," she whispered. Her voice was soft but filled with truth. The band returned to the stage, preparing to continue the night. But everyone knew the evening had already been transformed. People no longer cared about the small talk of money and gossip. They spoke about the girl who had played, the waitress who had silenced the hall with music. Some said they would never forget it. Others said it was the most powerful moment they had ever seen in this ballroom. Emily slipped quietly back toward the staff curtain. Her fellow waiters rushed to her. Some hugged her, some patted her shoulder. Their eyes were shining. "You were incredible," one said. "I always knew there was something special about you," said another. For the first time, she did not brush their praise aside. She accepted it, because tonight she had proved to herself that it was true. The rest of the night passed in a blur. Emily returned to her duties, carrying trays and filling glasses, but everything was different. The guests no longer looked at her as if she were invisible. Many smiled warmly at her. Some even thanked her as she passed. She was still a waitress in her uniform, but now she carried something more: respect. When the event finally ended and the guests began to leave, the wealthy man found her again near the staff door. He pressed a card into her hand. "Come see me tomorrow," he said. "We will make arrangements. The world must hear you play." Emily's eyes filled with tears. She nodded, holding the card tightly as if it were the key to a new life. Later, as she walked home through the quiet city streets, the night air cool against her face, she clutched the card to her chest. Her uniform was still the same, her shoes still worn, but her heart felt different, lighter, stronger, filled with a fire she had not felt in years. She looked up at the stars and whispered, "Papa, I will not stop now." In her small apartment, the old broken keyboard still sat in the corner, dust covering its surface. She touched it gently, running her fingers across the chipped keys. "You brought me this far," she whispered to it. "But now, I will go further." For the first time, she did not feel trapped by her life. She felt ready to begin again. The cruel words, the laughter, the shame, none of it mattered anymore. What mattered was that she had found her courage. She had shown the world her music, and the world had listened. Emily lay down to sleep, her heart still echoing with the sound of applause. She knew the path ahead would not be easy, but she also knew one truth that would guide her forever. She was no longer just a waitress. She was a pianist, a dreamer, a fighter. And from this night on, she would never let her music be silenced again.